Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Before we start, my apologies for being late with this episode. I was on holiday and ended up having pretty bad jet lag and an airplane-borne lurgy. I'm back now and ready to get into something a little mystical and mysterious. Legendary substances from alchemy. Alchemy is an ancient branch of natural philosophy, the early study of nature, that combined mysticism with scientific observation in order to explain and possibly manipulate the natural world. Purification of natural substances as well as the human body featured heavily. In pursuit of these goals, laboratory techniques and theories were developed, some of which are still in use today by modern scientists. Secrecy was a large part of alchemy as well, and the use of codes and ciphers to protect the alchemists' work were common. There were two branches of alchemy: the practical applications of pre-scientific techniques called exoteric alchemy, and the spiritual aspects of self-transformation called esoteric alchemy. Alchemy was practiced in China, India, the Muslim world, and Europe over thousands of years. The term alchemy was first used in the 12th century CE in Europe for a branch of astrology which attempted to discover the relationship and influence of the stars on the terrestrial world and humans. Before this, what Westerners called alchemy, the Greeks, Chinese, and Indian alchemists referred to as the art. It was characterized as divine, sacred, and mystical. There were two main goals of alchemy: transmutation, or changing one substance into another, and to create the elixir of life, a mythical substance that granted immortality. Through attempts to achieve these goals, much was learned about the properties, reactions, and components of many natural substances. Ideas about the composition of the cosmos were also contemplated and categorized. Experimentation with transmutation appears to originate in Egypt around 2500 BCE with the development of fermentation and glasscraft. Fermentation is the process by which sugars are transformed into alcohol through the activity of microorganisms. While the ancient Egyptians didn't have the knowledge to explain the process, they perfected techniques to get their desired results, be it bread, beer, or wine. For glass-making, crushed quartz and plant ash were heated to extreme temperatures, causing them to melt together, which appeared to transform them into a new substance. The glass was first made into discs that were then heated again and shaped like clay into luxury objects. This type of glass is called faience. In China, alchemical work toward the elixir of life is first documented around the 1st century BCE. References exist in about 100 texts that are part of the Taoist canon, along with feng shui and astrology. Chinese alchemy was more centered on the elixir of life and the creation of medicines. While seeking the formula for the elixir, Chinese alchemists invented black powder, also known as gunpowder. Alchemy appears in Greco-Roman Egypt in the first few centuries CE. Alexandria was the center for alchemical thought for most of the Greek and Roman era in Egypt. The writings of Zosimos of Panopolis, which date to around 300 CE, contain commentary on earlier alchemical works and suggest that alchemy in Egypt began with ceremonial practices surrounding metalwork. Indian and Islamic alchemical works remain elusive. There are few texts specifically about alchemy, so scholars are dependent on occasional mentions of these works in other Indian and Islamic writings, mostly natural philosophy and medicine. Like Chinese alchemists, alchemists of the Islamic world were more focused on health and immortality rather than the creation of gold. Much alchemical writing across history consists of recipes and procedures for breaking down substances into their base elements. In European alchemy, the base elements were earth, fire, air, and water. The theory that everything in nature is composed of these four elements is called the four-element theory and was composed by Empedocles, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle also included a mixing medium called ether. I'll talk more about this after the break. The four-element theory persisted until the 17th century and contributed to the four humors system of medicine. In four-element theory alchemy, any base element can transform into one another through changes in heat, cold, wetness, and dryness. For example, water turns to earth when wet leaves and dry takes over. Water may turn into fire if cold and wet leave and hot and dry appear. These early theories led to more solid ones, such as earth plus water can be solidified by heat as it drives off water, or by cold, which removes heat. For example, mud, which is made of earth and water, dries out in the heat and freezes solid in the cold. Metals were seen as being made of water, as they are all melted by heat. All substances on Earth were thought to be made up of several elements and could be changed through adding or removing other elements. This seems almost rational, but other aspects were also part of the process, such as the influence of celestial bodies on the procedure and the inclusion of magical words. During the Renaissance in Europe, medical, pharmaceutical, occult, and entrepreneurial branches of alchemy developed. Older alchemical works were translated into Latin so more people could read them. Alchemy was blended with Christianity, Kabbalah, occultism, astrology, and a new interest in chemicals and minerals. An alchemist became a real profession and were contracted by the elite for practical purposes relating to mining, medicine, and the production of chemicals, metals, and gemstones. As modern science developed over the centuries, the practice of alchemy declined. Rigorous quantitative experimentation replaced the search for ancient wisdom. Even so, some rational scientists, including Sir Isaac Newton, thought alchemy was worth experimenting with. Around 1720, a clear distinction between alchemy and chemistry formed, as chemists loudly rejected the old practices of alchemy. The possibility of creating gold through chemical processes was finally disproven through rigorous scientific effort in the 19th century. This is when alchemy leaned into its more occult and spiritual aspects. During the Victorian revival of alchemy, occultists reinterpreted it as a spiritual practice of self-transformation rather than the transformation of laboratory substances. This is how magic and alchemy merged in popular thought. Groups like the Freemasons and the New Age movement continue to use alchemical symbolism. Old alchemical literature is still of interest, as it's believed by some that past alchemists achieved their goals of everlasting life and gold from any metal, but the information was lost. Charlatanism, or quackery and fraud, has been a prominent feature of European alchemy since the 16th century. This has led many scientists, scholars, and historians of chemistry to view alchemy in general as completely fake. While aspects of pharmacy and chemistry may have developed through the work done by alchemists, the goals of alchemy had to be abandoned in order for them to do so. There were several substances that were crucial to alchemy from the start, such as mercury and sulfur. Alchemical symbols were used to denote these and other chemical elements and compounds, as well as alchemical apparatuses and processes. These were used until the 18th century. I'm going to dive into the substances most important to alchemy, but first, an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can get ad-free episodes by joining our Patreon community at the lowest tier, $2 a month. You can listen to the patron-only episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever podcast app you use. You also gain access to outtakes, pub quizzes, meditations, and our Discord server. Go to bit.ly/morbidpatron and join our creepy community. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron. You'll have our eternal gratitude. The goals of alchemists were the transmutation of base metals into precious metals and the creation of an elixir of immortality. A mystical substance called the Philosopher's Stone was a large piece of many alchemists' recipes. The Philosopher's Stone is one of the more well-known alchemical substances today. It was said to be capable of turning base metals into gold or silver. Additionally, alchemists believed it could be used to make the elixir of life. For many centuries, the Philosopher's Stone was the most sought-after goal in alchemy. It was the central symbol of alchemy, representing perfection, divine illumination, and heavenly bliss. All efforts to discover the Philosopher's Stone were known as the magnum opus, or great work. The properties most commonly associated with the stone were the ability to transmute any metal into a precious metal, the ability to heal all forms of illness, and prolong the life of any person who consumed it. The way to consume it involved pulverizing a small part of the stone into a powder and diluting it in wine. Other abilities included the creation of perpetually burning lamps, transmutation of common crystals into precious stones and diamonds, reviving dead plants, the creation of flexible or malleable glass, the creation of a clone of a person, and the creation of a homunculus, a miniature, fully formed human. Descriptions of the Philosopher's Stone are numerous and varied, making it difficult to actually visualize what it's supposed to look like. According to some alchemical texts, there were two varieties of the stone, white and red. The white stone was a less mature version of the red stone and was used for making silver. The red was for making gold. There are few clues in medieval alchemical texts about the physical appearance of the red stone. It's often said to be orange or red when ground to a powder. Other descriptions state it's somewhere between red and purple and transparent like glass. The weight is said to be extremely heavy. The Philosopher's Stone, red or white, is said to be soluble in any liquid but unharmed by fire. Many alchemical writers believe that the history of the Philosopher's Stone goes all the way back to the creation of humanity, in which Adam acquired the knowledge of the stone directly from God. This knowledge was said to have been passed down through biblical patriarchs, which is what granted them such long lives. The earliest documented discussion of the Philosopher's Stone comes from Zosimos of Panopolis around 300 CE. His text is one of the earliest works dedicated to alchemy and suggests that it was well established by that point in history. The theoretical recipe for creating the stone can be traced to Greek philosophy. According to Plato, the four elements sprang from a common source called prima materia, or first matter, which was associated with chaos. Prima materia also referred to the first ingredient for the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. What this was is unclear, but the importance of the prima materia persisted throughout the history of alchemy. Early medieval alchemists of the Byzantine and Arabic empires built upon the work of Zosimos. The 8th century alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, Latinized as Geber, analyzed each alchemical substance in terms of the four basic elements. Fire was hot and dry, earth was cold and dry, water was cold and moist, and air was hot and moist. He theorized that every metal was a combination of these four principles, two of them interior and two exterior. He believed that transmutation of one metal into another resulted from the rearrangement of its basic qualities. This change required a special substance, which came to be called zerion in Greek and al-iksir in Arabic. And yes, this is where the word elixir comes from. This substance described by Geber was a dry red powder made from the Philosopher's Stone. The precursor to the Philosopher's Stone was known as Diana's tree, or the Philosopher's tree. This substance resembled crystalline coral in its shape. It was an amalgam of crystallized silver obtained from mercury in a solution of silver nitrate. For alchemists, silver was associated with the moon. Diana was the Roman goddess of the moon, hence the name Diana's tree. Creating Diana's tree was exceedingly time-consuming, in some cases taking 40 days to complete. Experiments involving the tree aimed to turn non-precious metals into precious metals, similar to the Philosopher's Stone. In the 11th century, debate sprung up among chemists of the Muslim world on whether the transmutation of substances was possible. The leading opponent was Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, the famous Persian philosopher and physician. Avicenna discredited the theory of transmutation of substances, saying that chemists know that you can't change one substance into another, but you can create the appearance of such a change. According to many later writers, the 13th century scientist and philosopher Albertus Magnus discovered the Philosopher's Stone. Magnus does not confirm this in his own writings, but he did state that he witnessed the creation of gold by, quote, transmutation, end quote. The legend states he passed the Philosopher's Stone on to his pupil, Thomas Aquinas, shortly before his death. However, Thomas Aquinas died 6 years before Magnus' death, debunking this legend. The fact that Magnus also died debunks the idea that he had the Philosopher's Stone. The 16th century Swiss alchemist Paracelsus believed in the existence of Alkahest, an undiscovered element from which all other elements, earth, fire, water, and air, derived from. Paracelsus believed that this element was also the Philosopher's Stone. I'll talk about Alkahest in a moment. Apart from the physical changes the stone can enact, the transmutation powers of the stone have also been interpreted as a psychological process. Through the stone, late alchemists thought that humans could achieve spiritual transmutation or enlightenment. In his 1964 book, The Sufis, which is an academic overview of Sufism, the mystical aspects of Islam, Idris Shah, an Afghan philosopher, devoted an entire chapter to a detailed analysis of the symbolism of working with the Philosopher's Stone. His analysis featured a linguistic interpretation of one of the terms for the stone, Azoth. Azoth has been linked to various mystical and spiritual practices outside of alchemy. Some traditions regard Azoth as a metaphor for internal transformation to a higher state of consciousness. As a symbol, Azoth was thought to embody the process of turning base human traits into divine virtues, similar to the transformation of base metals into gold. The Philosopher's Stone is said to have another purpose, a universal solvent, a substance that can dissolve any other substance, creating a solution. But there's another alchemical substance that's credited with this role, Alkahest. There is still debate whether Alkahest and the Philosopher's Stone are the same substance or two different substances. In Renaissance alchemy, Alkahest was theorized to be a universal solvent, capable of dissolving any composite substance, including gold, without altering or destroying its fundamental components. Alchemists believed they could gain control of invaluable healing properties by extracting fundamental properties and virtues from composite substances. For this reason, Alkahest was earnestly sought by many, even though its existence was debated among alchemists and philosophers. The recipe for Alkahest was a closely guarded secret, as were most alchemical recipes. Still, there were many recipes written down, as there were many alchemists attempting to obtain it. Some of these recipes were experimental and later rejected by their creators for being ineffective. As I mentioned, one of the first to discuss Alkahest was Paracelsus. Paracelsus' own recipe for Alkahest included caustic lime, also known as calcium hydroxide, alcohol, and carbonate of potash, which is another name for potassium carbonate, which is what leaks from old batteries. However, Paracelsus' recipe was not intended as a universal solvent. He described it as a chemical to fortify the liver, and if the liver failed, it could act as a substitute. Alkahest became very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries despite its absurd and extreme qualities. Flemish chemist Jean-Baptiste Helmont expanded on the idea of alkahest, claiming that knowledge of the recipe was granted by God and was therefore known by few. He stated that he'd had many dreams in which he believed the recipe had been revealed to him, only to find them inadequate. Johann Rudolf Glauber, a German-Dutch alchemist, suggested that alkahest was a class of substances rather than one particular substance. Glauber believed he had discovered alkahest after discovering that volatile niter, also known as nitric acid, which is used in fertilizers and explosives today, and fixed niter, another name for potassium carbonate, were able to dissolve several substances. The recipe for alkahest was sought in several obscure liquids. Colonial American alchemist George Starkey suggested that the secret ingredient for making alkahest was urine. Tobias Ludwig Collens suggested in the mid to late 1600s that alkahest could be found in the liquid that had been discovered in the lymphatic vessels of animals. The theory of how alkahest could dissolve any substance but not destroy its components was described by mid-17th century Anglo-Irish scientist Robert Boyle. He suggested the alkahest was composed of extremely small homogeneous corpuscles, which allowed it to move between the corpuscles of all other materials and mechanically separate them without altering their base materials or itself. At the end of the 17th century, many alchemists began to see alkahest as merely fantasy and wishful thinking. The key issue, as proposed by German alchemist Johann Kunkel, was that if alkahest dissolves everything, then it cannot be contained because it would dissolve the container. By the 18th century, alkahest was largely discredited. According to ancient and medieval alchemists, the fifth element, or quintessence, is the material that fills the region of the universe beyond the terrestrial sphere. This element was sometimes referred to as ether. The word means pure, fresh air, or clean sky in Homeric Greek. In Greek mythology, ether was thought to be the pure essence that filled the space where the gods lived, analogous to air breathed by mortals. In his work Timaeus, ancient Greek philosopher Plato mentions a most translucent kind of air known as ether, but doesn't include it in the classical system of four elements. Aristotle, a student of Plato's, originally agreed with his teacher, emphasizing that fire can be mistaken for ether. However, he later introduced a new first element to the system of classical elements. He suggested that the four terrestrial elements were subject to change and naturally moved linearly. However, there was an element located in the celestial regions and heavenly bodies that moved circularly. The idea of ethereal spheres moving with natural circular motion led to Aristotle's explanation of the movement of the stars and planets in perfectly circular motions. He also suggested that ether had none of the qualities of the terrestrial elements. It was neither hot nor cold, neither wet nor dry. Later commentators started referring to this element as the fifth element, as well as ether. Medieval alchemists referred to this fifth element as quintessence. It was thought that there was very little quintessence on Earth, and because of that, the Earth could be affected by anything that occurred within the heavenly bodies. Ether was also used to explain several natural phenomena, such as how light travels through space and how gravitational forces extend out from massive objects. In the late 19th century, physicists theorized that ether permeated space, providing a medium through which light could travel in a vacuum, but evidence for the presence of such a medium was never found. Due to ether's pure and heavenly quality, it was thought that consuming it might remove any impurities or illnesses in the human body. Medicinal alchemy sought to isolate ether and include it in medicines and elixirs. A process recorded for the creation of ether involved the distillation of alcohol 7 times. 7 is a number that is often associated with magic. In the 1670s, Sir Isaac Newton used the idea of ether to match observations to strict mechanical rules of his physics. Even after ether theories were considered to be scientifically obsolete, ether continued to inspire scientists. Albert Einstein, whose theories replaced the theory of ether, noted that his theories could be thought of as including ether, as they implied that the empty space between objects had its own physical properties. And now for some substances that are a little more down to earth. One of the main ingredients used by alchemists that actually exists is mercury, which was commonly called quicksilver. It was formerly named hydrargyrum from the Greek word hydro, water, and argyros, silver, which is why it's represented on the periodic table of elements as Hg. Mercury is silvery and heavy and is the only metallic element that is known to be liquid at standard temperature and pressure. Mercury occurs naturally in deposits throughout the world, mostly as cinnabar, which is a red crystal-like stone resembling quartz. Exposure to mercury and mercury-containing organic compounds is extremely toxic to the nervous system, immune system, and kidneys of humans and other animals. Mercury dissolves many metals, such as gold and silver, to form amalgams, or alloys, which is why alchemists were so interested in it. Alchemists thought mercury was the first matter from which all metals were formed. They believed that different metals could be produced from mercury by adding or removing certain amounts of sulfur. The purest of these was gold, and mercury was called for in many attempts at transmutation. Mercury doesn't react with iron, however, so iron flasks were traditionally used to contain it. The use of mercury in alchemy is first documented in China. The first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huangdi, was reportedly killed in 2010 BCE by drinking a mercury and powdered jade mixture created by alchemists, which was intended as an elixir of immortality. He was also allegedly buried in a tomb that contained a model of China, in which all the rivers were represented by flowing rivers of mercury. The goals of alchemy in India included the creation of a divine body. Sanskrit alchemical texts include information surrounding the manipulation of mercury and sulfur, which were considered to be the semen of the god Siva and the menstrual blood of the goddess Devi. In the early 10th century CE, Geber, who I mentioned earlier, wrote that mercury and sulfur should be included in the base elements of creation, alongside earth, fire, air, and water. Mercury also fascinated the ancient peoples of the Americas. In Teotihuacan, Mexico, large quantities of mercury were discovered in a chamber 60 feet below the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the third largest pre-Aztec pyramid. In Lamanai, a major city of the ancient Maya civilization, a pool of mercury was found beneath a Mesoamerican ball court. Sulfur was known as brimstone, which means burning stone, due to its reactivity with certain metals. References to sulfur can be found in ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek writings as a medicine. Sulfur was used in China since the 6th century BCE. It's also mentioned in the Torah and Christian Bible, where it was associated with damnation. Early European alchemists made use of the combustibility of sulfur. Paracelsus suggested that sulfur was one of the 3 heavenly substances, which included mercury and salt as well. Flowers of brimstone, which is a fine powder made from sulfur, also fascinated alchemists, as it has slightly different properties than regular sulfur, such as being soluble in solutions that sulfur itself is not. Alchemical substances continue to inspire us. You may have heard of some of these substances thanks to films, TV, video games, and books in the modern fantasy genre. The Philosopher's Stone will forever be associated with Harry Potter, thanks to it being the subject of the first book. In the book, there is only one stone known to exist, and it was created in the 14th century by Nicholas Flamel. It's ruby red in color, and while it extends life, it doesn't make the drinker completely immortal or stop the aging process. The Japanese manga series, Fullmetal Alchemist, is set in a fictional 20th century where alchemy is a widely practiced science. The series follows two alchemist brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric, in their search for the Philosopher's Stone. In the Witcher game universe, alkahest is the main ingredient in the potion creation system, which is called alchemy. Alchemy is also the name of the potion-making system in the Elder Scrolls universe. Ether is a recurring item in the Final Fantasy games. Some Final Fantasy games also include alchemy as part of the crafting system. Alkahest is the name of an upcoming medieval action-adventure RPG, which I'm really excited about. It resembles a first-person version of the Witcher series with more focus on the alchemy aspects of the game. The player interacts with the environment to create alchemical weapons in order to strategize against goblin raiders and rival families. There's no magic, only alchemy. Alchemy also features heavily in many other games, such as Castlevania, Devil May Cry, Genshin Impact, Minecraft, Neverwinter, A Plague Tale, Silent Hill, World of Warcraft, and Dungeons & Dragons. It seems alchemy has survived to our modern era through the fantasy genre. While morbid curiosity is generally considered an interest in the macabre, it also applies to interests in the mysterious. Alchemists were desperately curious, seeking answers for occurrences in both the physical and spiritual world. I hope you've enjoyed this foray into the mystical and mysterious. Until next time, keep tending to your spark of morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.